you, Julia, and the Lake Johnson Park team for hosting this series. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen sharing going on here. How's that looking?
Looks good.
Great. Yeah, well, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. My name is Tom Green. I am the Outreach and Landowner Support Manager for the Hemlock Restoration Initiative in Asheville, North Carolina. And my talk tonight is entitled Renewed Hope for Hemlocks. And my goal is by the end of this talk, you will have as much hope as I do about the issue. So just a quick overview of what I'll talk about tonight. I'll give a little bit of an introduction to who I am and who our program, the Hemlock Restoration Initiative, is. I'll talk about hemlocks in North Carolina, a little bit about how important they are. I'll cover the invasive pest that's killing them, the hemlock woolly adelgid, and then I'll talk about some of the management approaches that we and others are using, and I'm hoping to save a bunch of time at the end for questions. So just to start with a real broad overview of the issue that I'm talking about tonight, we have hemlock trees, which in our area are a foundation species in the ecosystem. They're being affected by the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is a non-native invasive insect. And that's leading to massive mortality of hemlocks up and down the East Coast. The Hemlock Restoration Initiative is a program of an organization called WNC Communities, which is based in Western North Carolina. And we were started in 2014 at the direction of the Commissioner of Agriculture, Steve Troxler, who wanted to put some more resources into the issue of protecting North Carolina's hemlocks before they're all gone. So our parent organization, WNC Communities, does a lot of different programs in Western North Carolina supporting rural communities and the economic drivers of those communities. So including things like farming, agriculture, livestock, crops, and forestry as well. We are, WNC Communities is a 501c3, but our program in particular is funded through a few grants, particularly from the U.S. Forest Service, and then through the state and the Department of Agriculture and the North Carolina Forest Service, as well as some private foundation grants and private donations. So you're welcome to donate to us as well. And our organization has kind of a dual purpose. So we do on-the-ground management, working on the issue of hemlocks and hemlock woolly adelgid. And then we also do education and outreach. And basically our program is a collaborative partnership across many different entities and crossing the boundaries of different agencies, as well as trying to involve private partners as well. And our overall mission is to ensure that the native hemlocks, the Eastern and Carolina hemlock in North Carolina, can survive to maturity and withstand the hemlock woolly adelgid, both on public and private lands. I'll talk for a second about some of the various objectives that our program has. So the primary objective, which kind of everything follows from, is identifying and establishing what we call hemlock conservation areas, so areas with a significant hemlock component to them. Another one of our objectives is to increase the number of trees being chemically treated, hemlock trees in particular, being chemically treated on public lands in North Carolina. We're also working to implement integrated pest management, including long-term biological control of hemlock woolly adelgid with predators of the adelgid. We also support partners who are working on other control strategies and restoration techniques, typically longer-term approaches that are still, many of which are still in kind of the research stage. And so we support those partners in various ways. And then, as I mentioned, we also do education and outreach, particularly educating landowners about what they can do for their hemlock trees and how they can chemically protect them and keep them healthy, and do that in a safe and also economical way. So our work we call in situ conservation, and basically this means we want to find and maintain and protect hemlocks where they still are in the landscape. So we want to find those areas, typically on public lands for us, but also working on privately conserved lands with folks like land trusts, to find areas that still have some surviving hemlocks that are in a state to be able to have some management, some intervention, and hopefully recover. And so in those hemlock conservation areas that we establish, we develop long-term management plans for those areas, and then we begin to implement that management along with our partners. And we're not just targeting areas that are the old growth or mature hemlocks. We're also looking for areas that are younger forest with hemlocks that are in the understory or potentially regenerating. And I just want to give you an idea of what some of these areas look like. This is an area in Buncombe County on the Sandy Mush game land, a riparian area with a lot of important hemlocks. There's also many bluffs where especially Carolina hemlocks really thrive and are an important piece of the ecosystem. This is one of those bluffs. This is Hanging Rock State Park. This is my favorite natural Carolina hemlock bonsai tree. And North Carolina also has the largest surviving eastern hemlock tree. It's about 160 feet tall and 5 feet in diameter. You can see that guy on the right there giving a big hug. See if you recognize who he is. So a lot of important hemlocks in North Carolina. And we definitely couldn't do anything that we do without the help of our partners and the collaboration. So this is just a kind of an overwhelming graphic of representing many different partners that we work with, from state and federal agencies, local governments, land trust and other nonprofits, universities, just a whole suite of partners to be able to carry out this work. So we couldn't get any of this done without these partnerships. So let's talk about hemlock trees for a minute. We'll start with the big view. So there are 10 species of hemlocks worldwide. There's 6 species in Asia, and then 4 species in North America, 2 on the West Coast, and then 2 here on the East Coast. And I'll kind of jump ahead for a second and say that in all of the areas besides Eastern North America where there are hemlock trees, the insect I'm going to talk about, the pest, the hemlock woolly adelgid, is actually native to all of those other areas with those hemlock trees. So that'll be kind of important later on. And then to zoom in on the East Coast and North Carolina in particular, this is the range of our 2 native species, the Eastern hemlock, Tsuga canadensis, and the Carolina hemlock, Tsuga caroliniana. And the light green is the Eastern hemlock. I don't think you can see my cursor, but I'll try. So the Eastern hemlock goes all the way down from Alabama and northern Georgia up into Nova Scotia and Canada and Ontario, and as far west as Wisconsin and maybe a tiny bit into Minnesota. So a huge range for Eastern hemlock. Carolina hemlock, on the other hand, is an endemic species to the Southern Appalachian Mountains, and most of which you can see in the map on the right. Almost all that occurs in North Carolina, Western North Carolina, with just a little scattering across some of our neighboring states as well. Oh, I'll back up 1 second to point out, this will come back in a minute, but there is this tiny little population of hemlocks in Wake County, which is kind of an oddball outlier across the state here. Most of the hemlocks that you see here are basically just through the mountains. So these 2 species are similar, but they're kind of found in different places. So Eastern hemlocks They're the ones with the huge range from Alabama all the way up into Canada. They tend to grow in our area in the Southern Appalachians in cool, wet areas, either coves or along streams and rivers. Carolina hemlocks, on the other hand, like higher and drier sites, areas that are rocky and exposed, and they do really well in those areas. So that's one way. If you're out in the woods, you can kind of look at where you're at to see what species you might find. The other things you can look for are the needles and the cones. So eastern hemlock, their needles are coming out kind of in one plane from the branch. So you could lay that branch kind of flat on the table. And their needles are sometimes kind of different, a little bit different lengths. And then the cone of the eastern hemlock is quite small. The Carolina hemlock, you can see in the picture on the right, the larger cone there in that person's hand is the Carolina hemlock cone. And that's the Carolina hemlock cone is about the size of a ping pong ball, maybe a little smaller. And then the eastern hemlock cone is about a third of that size. And the Carolina hemlock branches, the needles come out kind of in a whorled pattern all the way out around the branch. And so if you see these two out in the wild, or you have a specimen that you're trying to identify, those are kind of the two main things to look for to tell them apart. So going back to our distribution of hemlocks in North Carolina, I think some of the folks here are probably in the Triangle area. So I wanted to make special mention of this kind of unique population out separate from most of the other hemlocks, at least the natural populations. So the Hemlock Bluffs Nature Preserve is in Cary, North Carolina, and it's a population of about 250 eastern hemlocks, and it's a natural population. It's not artificial planting, but it's a kind of a remnant from the last ice age. And that area where those hemlocks are found in that nature preserve also kind of harbors some other plants that you would typically think of as mountain plants. And so, as the glaciers retreated and things warmed up after the last ice age, most of those plants, their ranges shifted away from the Piedmont up into the mountains. But there's this one cool little spot, and kind of literally cool, on this north-facing bluff where hemlocks and other interesting mountain plants persist. And so this being a pretty special population has had attention from the state, from the North Carolina Forest Service, and from the state parks, and from the folks who run the nature preserve there, to help protect these trees from hemlock woolly adelgid. So I really encourage you, if you're in the Triangle area, I will admit I have never actually been there, but I encourage you to go visit and take a look at those trees. There's over 140 acres of area with 3 miles of trail kind of running throughout, and also a really nice nature center. So I really encourage anybody to go check that out and see those special trees, especially if you've never seen hemlocks, kind of in their natural state. Maybe you've seen planted ones, but go check those out. Or if you're from the mountains and you want to go out east for a trip, check out the nature preserve. So the question is, why do we care about these two species of tree? Well, hemlocks, where they're found, are called a foundation species, and that means they are a key driver of lots of things happening in the ecosystem. So hemlocks in particular in the Southern Appalachians have a huge impact on hydrology in the streams and rivers. So everything from shading the streams to keep them cool, to filtering out pollutants from the land, slowing water as it travels through the soil, and hanging on to the banks, preventing erosion. And they really are a pillar of our healthy streams in our mountain areas. They also, being a long-lived and large tree, contribute greatly to the structure of the forest, both as living and dead trees. They're really important for carbon and nitrogen cycling, and store lots of carbon in their trunks, but also in their fallen needles and twigs and branches and all of that. When they're healthy, they have these beautiful lush crowns that can come all the way down to the ground. And they create this really shady, cool microclimate, different than the surrounding broadleaf deciduous forests. And so that changes what can live under and even in those hemlock trees. And they also have a huge impact on the food web. So the little critters, arthropods, insects, spiders, things like that living in them, all the way up to the birds that are eating those things, the mammals that might be feeding on the cones or on the twigs. So they have a huge impact on the food webs. And all of this contributes to the biodiversity in areas where hemlocks are found. And so really, it's not about saving these individual species. It's about maintaining the ecosystems that these trees support, and all kinds of plants and animals and fungi that these trees are so important to. And there's no other tree that can fill this ecological niche. There's been research into trying to find something to replace the hemlocks in areas where hemlock woolly adelgid is gone. And there's really nothing else that can perform the same function. So what is affecting our hemlock trees? Well, it's called the hemlock woolly adelgid. And there are many things that, that can affect hemlock trees, but hemlock woolly adelgid is the single greatest threat to their health and sustainability in the eastern United States. So just to give you an idea of the range that's covered by the hemlock woolly adelgid now, and this map is pretty much up to date. There's maybe a little bit more area covered now in the last few years, but this will give you kind of the general idea of how this spread throughout the East. So it was originally found in Richmond, Virginia in the 1950s, and was likely here before that, probably brought over on a tree from Japan, likely a Japanese hemlock that was planted in a garden. And then over the course of years was eventually started to spread through Virginia. And you can see the darker colors are the oldest infestations. And then as it gets lighter and lighter, that's the newest infestations. And so by about 2010, most of the areas in North Carolina with hemlocks had some presence of hemlock woolly adelgid. And then now to this date, basically all of the southern range, with the exception of the westernmost part of Alabama, all the southern range of eastern hemlock has hemlock woolly adelgid present. And that also means that the entire range of Carolina hemlock has hemlock woolly adelgid. So to introduce you a little bit more in detail to this, this bug, it is a true bug. And an adelgid is kind of like an aphid, but they're not exactly the same. But they are bugs that have kind of a piercing, sucking mouth part. And they actually, the thing I like about showing this graphic is that it shows that they have 2 generations a year, which is kind of interesting, but also is a part of the reason why they can be such a big problem. A couple other things I like to point out on here, besides the 2 different generations, are a couple life stages. So when they hatch out of their eggs, they're in what we call the crawler life stage. And for the hemlock woolly adelgid we have here on the East Coast of North America, this is the only stage where they're going to move around. And so they'll hatch out of their egg and they will try and find a new hemlock needle to attach to the base of. And once they attach to the base of that needle, they'll stay there for the rest of their life cycle until they develop into being an adult and laying their eggs. And then what most people see are actually those white cotton ball, fluffy looking things where they get their woolly name. That's actually the egg sac. So the adult, creates this, it's actually a waxy substance, creates this coating, and then, it offers a little bit of protection to the adelgid, but really it's going to become the egg sac. So how does this tiny little bug kill these massive hemlock trees? Well, there's a few things. One is on the East Coast here, all of the adelgid we see are females. So every little cotton ball looking thing on the underside of a hemlock branch, they're all females, and they're all capable of reproducing asexually. In the east, there aren't any co-evolved predators, so there's no natural enemies for these bugs. There are some things that will snack on them here and there, but there's nothing really controlling their population as a predator. And then on hemlock trees, there's no other real competition for them. They're kind of the only thing around that's feeding in the way they do on our hemlocks here. And they can be spread around in that crawler stage in lots of different ways. So they're basically like little dust specks. They can be carried by the wind. Often they'll get on birds and can be carried miles on a bird. Other animals can carry them around. And then people are really good at moving them around. Not so much as crawlers as by moving around planted trees. So nursery stock or moving a tree, which is how we thought it got here on the East Coast originally anyway. Hemlocks are an abundant host typically. They'll often grow in dense stands, so it's easy for the adelgid to move around even though they're in that tiny little crawler stage. There also wasn't really any early action or regulation prohibiting movement. It took years before they realized it was going to be a big forest health problem, and by then the adelgid had established so much it was hard to contain. And then on a kind of a biological level, the way they actually kill the tree is when they're feeding on the tree. It's not so much that they're depriving the tree of nutrients as it is that the tree, Eastern and Carolina hemlocks, have a reaction to the woolly adelgid that's almost like an allergic reaction that other hemlock trees where the adelgid's native, the other species don't have that same reaction to the adelgid. And so the tree starts to shut down the needles where the adelgid's feeding. And then bit by bit, it's almost like a death by 1,000 cuts. The more needles that tree loses, the less it can photosynthesize, the harder it is for it to move water, and eventually the trees will die. So this tiny little bug reproducing in the millions and millions has led to massive mortality of our hemlock forests in the areas where it's spread. And this has some serious consequences for the ecosystem, but also for the genetic future of these populations. So when you start to lose this many trees, you start to lose genetic diversity. It can cause problems with inbreeding, and then that just reduces the overall fitness of these species, especially in the face of climate change. So what can we do about it? Well, what we're working on, we call integrated pest management, or IPM. And there's a few different aspects to that for hemlock woolly adelgid management. One that many people are familiar with is chemical control with insecticides. There's also work going on with predators of the hemlock woolly adelgid as a biological control solution. There's been some genetic resource conservation with collecting seeds and creating seed banks and seed orchards. So as different populations die, we don't completely lose that genetic diversity. There's also research into silviculture or forest manipulation methods to help reduce the stress on the hemlocks when they're infested. And then there's also folks researching resistance in hemlocks. So Eastern and Carolina hemlocks don't really show much innate resistance to the adelgid, but there are researchers looking for possible candidates that can be bred to perhaps enhance some small kind of latent characteristics. So I'm going to talk about, before I get to that, I like to say that it's really going to take all of these strategies in combination to be able to ensure the long-term survival of hemlocks in the East in the presence of hemlock adelgid. And so for me, IPM, or integrated pest management, I like to think of as just using all of the tools in the toolbox. So there's no one single one of these solutions that will be the standalone. It's really going to take using all of these approaches. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these in detail, and then I'll touch on the last few. So I want to start with talking about chemical control. And as I mentioned before, one of the hemlock restoration initiative's objectives is to increase how many trees have received chemical treatment on our state lands in North Carolina. And so we work with all of the state agencies that manage land in North Carolina, like the state forests, the state park, and the Wildlife Resource Commission, to be able to go out and find these areas and chemically protect some of the hemlocks that are still surviving. We do this with our partner agencies. We bring hired crews. We work with a program called the Bridge Program through the North Carolina Forest Service. That is a program that teaches young incarcerated men not just forest fire and prescribed burning skills, but also other kind of forest management, including hemlock treatment. And so we get out there in the woods. We also utilize volunteers as well. I don't think I have a volunteer picture on here, but so we're out there in the woods, and we are trying to ramp up how many trees in our state lands that have gotten chemical protection so that we can hang on to what we still have before we lose it all. And so since HRI started doing chemical treatments in 2016, we, and particularly also our partners in the North Carolina Forest Service, have been able to treat over 100,000 trees across our state lands. So this doesn't include the work that's going on national forests in North Carolina or in Great Smoky Mountain National Park. So that's just on our state lands. And to give you a frame of reference, in the about 8 years before that, there had only been about 10,000 trees treated on state lands in North Carolina. So to give you an idea of what I'm talking about when I talk about chemical treatment and chemical control of woolly adelgid, really, I think of it in terms of how we're applying the insecticide to the tree. And so there's a few different ways you can do that. We primarily work with systemic insecticides, and those can be either applied to the soil or to the trunk of the tree. You can also spray hemlock trees with a contact insecticide like a horticultural oil or an insecticidal soap. But really, you need to be able to cover the whole tree to control the hemlock woolly adelgid. And so that's not really feasible in a forested landscape with large trees. So we primarily use neonicotinoid systemic insecticides for that. And there are definitely some upsides to chemical treatment. So we know that on a tree-by-tree basis is very effective and reliable in eliminating the adelgid and protecting that tree from hemlock woolly adelgid. For us and also even for landowners in North Carolina, it's fairly easy to acquire, and it's pretty simple to apply these chemicals safely to the tree. And it's much cheaper to for a landowner to chemically protect their tree than to pay to have that tree removed. And chemical treatment will last for a number of years with a systemic, so it's not something you have to do every year. And if you are familiar with hemlock treatment in the past, there's a few things that folks might not be aware of in terms of recent updates. So one is that the primary chemical used, called imidacloprid, now has several generics available, which has made it much cheaper to treat a hemlock tree. So just to give a random example, if you have a tree that's about a foot across in diameter, you can buy imidacloprid and treat that tree yourself for around $2. It's really quite cheap now. There's also research showing that imidacloprid will last in a tree anywhere from 5 to 7 years, and then you have some time where the tree will need to get reinfested. So really, you can get, anywhere between 5 and 10 years of protection before you'll need to retreat again. There's also optimized dosing of imidacloprid for hemlock trees in particular, and that helps reduce the amount of chemical needed to protect the tree, and that saves on money and also reduces the amount of chemical going out into the environment. And then there's some new products, including one called Cortect, which is a tablet form of imidacloprid And this has made it easier to get into remote areas or to treat many small trees quickly. But there are definitely some downsides to chemical treatment as well, which I want to acknowledge. So first of all, it's really a short-term temporary solution. We don't expect to be out there in the woods for the next several decades trying to chemically treat every hemlock. It must be done on an individual tree by tree basis, which is very labor intensive and costly. And there is a cost every time you chemically treat a tree. And as with using any insecticide, there's always a risk of off-target exposure, which is something we're very concerned about. So I want to take a second to address that a little bit. So I mentioned the chemicals we use are systemic neonicotinoids, which are very toxic to invertebrates. They were designed to be relatively safe or safer for the applicator and for vertebrates, but basically these are very good insecticides. And so when we're thinking about our off-target impacts, the risk is really made up of two things. One is, the hazard of the chemical itself, but really that is also combined with the exposure, with the potential exposure. And so if you take those two things together, the hazard and the exposure, that is what's going to create your ultimate risk. And so if you have something like a neonicotinoid that is pretty hazardous, if you can reduce the amount of potential exposure, that's really going to help you mitigate that risk. And so with hemlock treatment, what are our real risks to pollinators here? Well, it really comes down to how you're using the chemical and where you're applying the chemical. And so in our treatments, we are, for the soil treatments, just putting it right at the base of the tree. So for hemlock treatment, you really only need to put the chemical in the ground within about a foot or two of the base of the tree. We also have some guidance on using a 10-foot setback from water, from surface water. And there's research showing that maintaining that distance from water for a soil treatment shouldn't have an impact on the invertebrates in the stream, which is really what we're worried about. You can also take measures to avoid applying the chemical to the roots of other flowering plants or trees that might be around the hemlocks. For the hemlocks themselves, it's fortunate that they are wind pollinated and they don't produce as much resin as some other conifers, which insects will often use. And so if we can be careful in how we're applying the chemical and combine that with the overall limited use of pollinators to hemlocks, then we can reduce that risk. And looking at it in the big picture, we do have research showing that more insects that live in hemlocks are going to be negatively impacted by the loss of that habitat than are likely to be affected by using very targeted and low dose treatment with imidacloprid. And there's many studies on this, and there's a very nice kind of white paper that condenses a lot of that research, which we have available on our website if people are interested in reading that. So really, we're not talking about a no risk option here, but we do think it is a fairly low risk option for the environment. And anytime we're making a management decision, we're really dealing with trade-offs there. And so with those decisions, we need to evaluate the costs versus the benefits of what we're going to do. And then whatever we do decide to do, minimize those potential risks. So I want to move on from the chemical treatment to looking at biological control. And so for hemlock woolly adelgid, this has really involved looking at predators of the adelgid in areas where hemlock woolly adelgid is native. And so I mentioned before that in the eastern North America, there aren't really any good natural predators that can control the adelgid populations. So the idea is to establish what would be more of a natural predator-prey cycle. So that's why I put the lynx and hare up there. If you imagine that kind of classic graph of a lynx hare curve, population curve, where the more hair you have, the more lynx can survive. And then as the lynx eat the hair, then the lynx population goes down. And so that's something we see with areas where hemlock woolly adelgid is native. There's predators that are suppressing that adelgid population. And so that's what we're trying to establish here, is some kind of natural cycle that will push down the adelgid to a low enough level that the hemlock trees can survive. So this is a longer term solution as opposed to chemical treatment. It happens on a landscape scale and ideally is self-perpetuating. Unfortunately, currently, it's not yet reliable as a standalone solution or something that we as land managers or individual landowners can really count on to keep your hemlock trees alive, and especially to restore a sick hemlock. So there's a lot of work that goes into evaluating these biocontrol agents. So some of the things that are looked for in this research process are that it's very host specific. So the host here would be the woolly adelgid. And so do these predators mainly prefer or completely prefer the woolly adelgid to other things? We also want to make sure these biocontrol agents would eat a lot of the adelgid and reproduce well, and that they can also search out new areas and disperse on their own so that we don't have to keep constantly intervening and moving them around. Ideally, the predator would feed on multiple life stages. So whether it's feeding on the eggs and the crawlers or the adults and the eggs, but somehow trying to cover as much of that hemlock woolly adelgid life cycle that I showed before as possible. And because eastern hemlock in particular has such a wide range, we want to make sure the biocontrol agents can handle all that range of climate conditions. So this is quite an intensive research process that can take up to a decade, and it's federally regulated in the US by an entity called APHIS, which is under the US Department of Agriculture. And so there have only been 4 different predator species approved for release and use as biocontrol agents for hemlock woolly adelgid. 3 of them are beetles and 1 of them is a fly. And there have been a number of other insects, even a fungus, that were looked at as possible biocontrols. And then for one reason or another, not ultimately pursued or approved for use. So this is a very long and research intensive process so that we can make sure we're not just taking something from the Pacific Northwest or from Asia and sticking out in the woods and seeing what happens. So it's really a thoughtful process that goes into how we use these predators. And I like to say that when biocontrol is working, you never hear about it. It's those cases where biocontrol has gone wrong that make headline news. But when these biocontrol agents, whether they're predators or something else, when they're functioning and blending into the ecosystem, it's really not headline news. And so that's what we hope for, is something that's going to blend in well and that you're not going to hear about unless you come to one of my talks. So to talk about a couple of these different predators, the first one I want to mention is the Laricobius beetle. So this is the primary predator that our organization has worked with. And in North Carolina, there are 2 species that have been released. So there's actually 3 shown in my diagram there. The one on the far right is the Laricobius rubidus. It's kind of a coppery color. That's actually a native Laricobius that doesn't typically feed on hemlocks and hemlock woolly adelgid. It actually lives on pine trees and feeds on a native pine bark adelgid. We do find it on hemlocks, and it's possible that it's feeding on hemlock woolly adelgid some, but clearly not enough to control the pest and keep it its population at a low enough level to keep the trees healthy. So 2 introduced species of Laricobius have been released. The first one was Laricobius nigrinus, which is the black one. Second from the right, that's from the Pacific Northwest. And so that was first released in the mid-2000s. And now we find that in most places we look in North Carolina. There's another species of Laricobius from Asia called Laricobius osakensis. And that was first released about 10 years after Laricobius nigrinus. And so it's only been out in the woods for less than about a decade. So it's still getting established in different areas. But we are definitely having success with Laricobius beetles. And what we do is they're reared in labs. So the picture on the lower left there is a rearing lab. And then they're released. And we actually go out and monitor for them and see if they're establishing and see if they're spreading. And so there's some really good news. Basically, wherever we look in North Carolina, whenever we go out to a site, we're looking for the beetles, and we often find them. And we find them far away from areas they've been released. They can travel, they can travel as much as like a mile a year on their own. But currently they're still studying, particularly at Virginia Tech, they're researching how much the Laricobius beetles are actually impacting the tree health. So we know they're established, we know they're reproducing, but are they actually able to have an impact on tree health? So one of the issues has to do with the Laricobius life cycle. So to bring you back to the adelgid life cycle, we have the longer generation of adelgid called the cystins, and the shorter generation that happens in the spring called the progrediens. So with those 2 generations a year, the Laricobius beetles primarily only feed on that long generation that's present through the winter and then lays its eggs in the spring. The adults will feed through the winter and lay their eggs. The adult beetles will lay their eggs in that woolly adelgid egg sac. And then when their larvae hatch out, they'll be feeding on adelgid eggs and on adelgid crawlers and nymphs until about April, late April, when they drop into the soil. And then through the summer, they're in the soil pupating. Well, that doesn't really cover the whole short second generation of adelgid. And so, so what we're seeing is a rebound in the adelgid population from that spring generation, which the Laricobius beetles aren't really taking care of. And so what we're going to need is some backup for the Laricobius beetles. Even though they're doing a good job, they're going to need some help. So there's another predator that's just in the last couple of years been approved to be used as a management tool and be released widely, which is called the silverfly or the Leucotraxis genus. And these are also from the Pacific Northwest, where they feed on hemlock woolly adelgid. And they actually cover part of the life cycle that the Laricobius covers, but then those other parts of the adelgid life cycle that are not covered by Laricobius beetles. So there's a lot of research going on, particularly up in the Northeast, especially at Cornell University, on how to rear and how to release these flies in a way where they can establish just as well as the Laricobius beetles have. So hopefully in the next 5 or 10 years, we'll get these flies established as well. And so we can start to create a community of predators, which you would find, you know, in the natural setting where adelgid's native. You wouldn't find just one thing eating the adelgid. There would probably be several different things munching on it and keeping its population in check. And so that's what we're aiming for with biocontrol, is to have that whole community of predators that are helping control the adelgid population. And before I wrap up, I want to just mention some of the other restoration strategies being researched.
Tom, we had a question about the introduction of the predator species.
Yeah.
Are they being affected by the chemical treatment that's being used to fight the woolly adelgid, or are you releasing them to like trees that aren't chemically treated?
That's a great question. So what we're doing, and I took out the slides that I sometimes use about this, we are trying to integrate those two approaches. So with chemical treatment, since it's a systemic treatment, it's only going to affect things that are going to be feeding on the tree, so the adelgid in particular. And so with the chemical treatment, there's really not an impact, a huge impact at least, on any predators that are present, except for a treated tree is not going to be harboring any food for those predators. And so there are ways to be able to integrate those. And sometimes we'll go in and we'll areas where we know there are predators, or we're looking to release them in the future. where we might not treat all the trees. We might selectively treat 3/4 or only half of the trees and let other trees continue to be infested with adelgid. And so those predator populations can persist on those untreated trees. And then eventually, hopefully in the long term, we can, maybe continue treating a small subset of that that population of hemlocks. And then more and more of those trees can come off of chemical protection and be protected by the predators. That's kind of the idea in theory. But right now, that's kind of in the early stages of being implemented as the integration of those two, the chemical and the biocontrol. But basically, if you have a tree, and even if there are predators in your area, chemically treating that tree isn't really going to affect the predators other than taking away their food source. So I hope that's kind of the question that was being asked, but I'm happy to discuss that more at the end too. Anything else before I'm about to wrap up, and then we'll have.
Yep, that's the only question that's popped up so far.
Okay, great. So I do want to mention the other long-term restoration strategies being researched and developed right now. So one thing that's actually had some good progress is the conservation of the genes across both Eastern and Carolina hemlocks native range. And so there are cold storage and also deep freeze cryo storage facilities storing some of those hemlock seeds. And then they're also planting seed orchards where they can track what the parent trees are for those cone-bearing trees, to be able to have sources if we need to repopulate areas. We'll have some of those more locally adapted seed sources. There's also some great research happening on breeding resistant hemlocks. And so there has been some effort to cross native hemlocks here with Asian species of hemlocks, but really the Carolina hemlock is the only one that'll cross. The Eastern doesn't seem to cross very well with other species. And so so Carolinas, are found in kind of a limited area. So for large scale reforestation, really they're looking for Eastern hemlocks that show some potential resistance that could then be bred and amplified. And so there's actually an organization associated with NC State called the Forest Restoration Alliance, working on that right here in North Carolina. We actually do volunteer days. Their research facility is in Waynesville, west of Asheville. And so if you're ever out in this area and want to do one of the volunteers days with them, you can get to learn about some of that breeding research. Then there's also some good research going on with forest management techniques, different silvicultural approaches, particularly one that's proving fruitful is exposing hemlock trees to more light. And so when a tree is receiving more light, when a hemlock tree is receiving more light, it seems to withstand the adelgid a little bit better. It doesn't completely eliminate the adelgid, but the tree does tend to put on more new growth than a shady tree and persist better. And so combining that with biocontrol or maybe a one-time chemical treatment, like I said, kind of using all of those tools in concert with each other, that could really be be a good strategy of how we can integrate all these different approaches. So just to cover some ways that you can get involved before I finish up here. One thing you can do is just to keep an eye on your trees and treat them if you would like to keep them healthy. We have lots of resources on our website on how you can do that. If you're in our area, you can come out and help us at a volunteer work day. We also lead educational hikes and give in-person training for landowners on how to protect their trees. And generally just spreading the word about what's happening with the hemlocks and hemlock woolly adelgid, especially in the western part of the state. We have a lot of people coming in who are new to the area and don't even know what a hemlock tree is, let alone that their hemlock tree might be sick from this bug that they can do something about. You can also support the state and federal initiatives happening to help control hemlock woolly adelgid. You're welcome to donate to our program. Like I said, we're a 501c3. You can follow us on social media. So we're Save the Hemlocks on Facebook and Hemlock_restoration_initiative on Instagram. And then please do check out our website, especially if you're interested in learning more about how to protect your trees. We have loads of resources on there. So I like to wrap up with this kind of take-home message. So there are many places that look like this, where the adelgid has come in and killed especially the largest trees very quick and created lots of impacts to the ecosystem. But for those areas, there are also these places where the hemlocks are still surviving and are able to respond to our chemical and biological control efforts. And so we need to do what we can now to protect those remaining trees so that this next generation of hemlocks, these little babies, can grow up to be the next forest of giants. All right, well, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, we've got some time for questions, and I'll leave my contact info up there for a minute, and maybe we can throw that in the chat too.
So at this point in time, if you have any questions for Tom, feel free to type those in the chat, or you'll find a microphone button, should be towards the top of your screen, that you can use to unmute yourself and ask a question out loud. And so knowing that Hemlock Bluffs is in the kind of triangle area, what kind of treatments are they doing there? Are they doing just chemical? Are they doing combinations of chemical and biological?
Great question. So basically what they're trying to do now is to keep the adelgid from really getting a foothold in there at all. And so that involves chemically protecting the trees. And I believe that they're basically trying to treat almost every tree they can of that, because it's a pretty small population, only, a couple hundred trees. I haven't been directly involved with that. I think the state parks and the State Forest Service have been maintaining that. But yeah, the idea is that if they can keep the adelgid from really infesting that area at all, that's the best chance that separated population has. There's hemlock woolly adelgid all over the place in the Piedmont. I've talked to a lot of folks who have planted hemlocks on their property. Orange County, Wake County, all the kind of counties around the Triangle area. People have planted hemlocks that seem to do pretty good, even though it's not really kind of where their natural range is right now. So those areas, they're harboring the adelgid, on those planted trees. So basically, if we wanted to introduce biocontrols, we'd have to sustain a population of adelgid on those trees, which at this point, since we can't rely on the biocontrols, on the predators, to keep the trees, healthy, keep the adelgid down to a level where the trees will stay healthy, the chemical treatment is the best way to keep that population at the Hemlock Bluffs, persisting.
So I know you said earlier on in your lecture that there's been some research looking into, if the hemlocks go away, is there something that can substitute it? Has it been explored looking at other species of hemlocks kind of filling in where the populations have died out of our native hemlocks, or have they just not taken to those areas or not filling that niche?
Yeah, so there's been some research, and I'm not completely well versed or like fully immersed in all of the research on like a replacement species. I know that the Western hemlock, for example, doesn't grow well in the East. And I'm not sure why. I've heard different things. It might have to do just with kind of the seasonal timing. So it's pretty mild on the West Coast, where I'm actually from, up in the Pacific Northwest, where Western hemlocks grow. And so it might have to do something with, the winters being too harsh here or something like that. But so Western hemlocks aren't really a good candidate. And in terms of introducing an Asian species for reforestation, I don't know if that's something anybody's really looked into, but it's not something anybody that I've heard of talking about as a viable option. But there has been research on whether we can use other native conifers, but nothing really fills that same function. So pine trees don't kind of do the same things that hemlocks do. I think they've looked maybe at a spruce to do the same things, but nothing has really panned out. There has been some effort to look into that, and like I said, nothing else can really do the same job.
So we got a couple of questions that popped up. So the first one is, in areas where the hemlock woolly adelgid is native, why don't the hemlock trees exhibit the allergic response that we're seeing in the Eastern and Carolina hemlocks?
Oh, that's a really good question. So the short answer is the researchers aren't quite sure, but it probably has something to do with the chemicals in the tree and how the tree reacts to the actual the piercing and feeding from the adelgid and its piercing sucking mouth part. And so they've looked at whether there's certain what they call like secondary compounds that the trees can make that help them withstand the adelgid or tolerate it better. But the short answer is they're not quite sure what it is, exactly that's different about like the Asian and Pacific Northwest species, so that why they don't have that same reaction where they they create, like the Eastern and Carolinas create like a scar kind of tissue when the adelgid feeds, and then that cuts off the water flow. But there is some research going on into that, but the short answer is they don't really know exactly what the difference is. What they're doing in terms of looking for native trees that might have resistance is when they can collect a sample, they're testing those in growing facilities to see if those trees that they test have any differences from other trees, other native trees that are susceptible to the native hemlocks. So the short answer is they're not quite sure, but they have looked into like some of those secondary compounds as possible candidates. And that could be something where they look into like genetic manipulation, like CRISPR. Folks know what CRISPR is. So there's some potential research into if they can use gene editing in Eastern or Carolina hemlocks. And it may involve turning off genes, like turning off the genes that cause the response in our Eastern hemlocks or East Coast species. But that's really like super early in the research phase. I don't want to put out any incomplete information, but yeah, so there's some cool research going on there of what we can do with the native trees to maybe develop even a partially resistant tree.
So somebody else asked about, they recalled you saying it takes about 5 to 10 years to implement the insects to eat the adelgid on a large scale. Why does it take so long for the biological management?
So thank you for that question, Isis. And feel free to unmute. Are you asking why it takes so long to go through the research process to approve a biocontrol agent?
Yes, and also, I guess once the research is done, like, why can't we research and, like, why can't it be a trial and error type situation?
Yeah, so the research itself, starts with like doing things in kind of like quarantined labs, so there's no chance that the predator, the fly or the beetle or whatever, could escape out into the native forest. And so they have to go through, rounds of testing, like for the things I mentioned of whether it's just going to eat the adelgid, whether it can reproduce well on, on the Eastern hemlock and Carolina hemlock woolly adelgid we have here. And so the research process just takes a while for all those reasons of having to do it in a lab until they're ready to do field trials. And then even then they have to assess whether in the field, do these predators survive? Are they able to persist on their own? Are they able to spread? And so the research just kind of inherently takes a long time. And then on a kind of a management level, once we're able to use, particular predator beetle or fly. It's kind of just logistics, and you're dealing with living organisms and they don't always cooperate. So we're fortunate in North Carolina that there's been a lot of work to release and distribute the Laricobius beetles. We're even better situated than a lot of other states in the east. But even with that, the Laricobius beetles were not able to just let the trees go, to their protection at this point. So, like I mentioned, where the adelgid's native, there's not just one thing feeding on them. So, in the past, since like 1995, so almost 30 years, there's only been these 4 species of predators that have been approved. So it takes a while, but ideally, long term, it'll be self-perpetuating, and we won't have to keep intervening. I hope that answers your question.
All right, so our final question for tonight is going to be, how far beyond the current expanse is the desired home range for the Eastern and Carolina hemlocks?
Do you mean, this is Chris, thanks for the question. Do you mean how far beyond the current range for the trees is suitable for the trees themselves, or are you saying how far has the adelgid spread?
I'm looking at the trees. If during the ice age they were all the way as far east as Wake County, where I'm assuming that the populations are decreasing currently, where are we looking to expand them back into the historical norms or the ideal home range?
Okay, yeah. So I mean, the current range is pretty much what the quote unquote natural range is. Over the course of millennia, the glaciers, as they moved south, pushed kind of what we think of as more northern trees, pushed those south, and then as the glaciers retreated, they pushed them, or they kind of naturally retreated north. I mean, we can see with climate change how the range that species currently cover is probably going to shift, and may even need to be kind of artificially helped along. But yeah, just basically, I would say it's going to get harder for hemlocks in the southern range, and it may be more suitable further north than they typically have lived, or further higher up in elevations in the north than they typically have lived. Unfortunately, climate change is also helping, I don't want to say helping, but helping the woolly adelgid, because the adelgid in the north has been kind of kept in check for years by cold winters. And so even if it's a bit more suitable, that range might spread for the hemlock trees, it's going to be even better for the adelgid, which is a problem. So yeah, but basically you can do some looking into the historical range of plants as they've spread up and down latitudes as the the glaciers came and then retreated.
Thank you, Tom. That's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you again for speaking with us. I know I've learned a lot from tonight's presentation. I'm sure everybody else has too. For those of you that are seeking environmental educators credit, I will send out that form along with the recording once that is available. So you should see that